We know John Kramer built an empire out of other people's suffering and called it justice. I mean, he became one of the most feared names in horror. He's turned murder into a crazy philosophy, but his philosophy can't stop a needle, and mind games don't work so well on someone like Dexter. To understand why this matchup is so one-sided, let's understand who John Kramer actually was, and more importantly, what he wasn't. First, John Kramer wasn't always the Jigsaw killer. Before he became the nightmarish mystery that detectives across the country couldn't seem to solve, he was a simple civil engineer. Successful, intelligent, and by most accounts, a man who genuinely believed in human potential. He even had a family once. But things started falling apart pretty quickly for him at one point. His wife, Jill, had a pregnancy that ended in a miscarriage. That was the first crack in John's head. Then came the cancer diagnosis. He had brain cancer that could not be operated on. And that was the second and final crack for him. The doctors told him he was out of time, and John decided that if he was going to die anyway, he'd spend whatever time he had left doing something he believed was meaningful. That something turned into one of the most elaborate and sadistic series of traps ever conceived, the Jigsaw Killer. Although the media called him the Jigsaw Killer, John didn't think of himself as a murderer, and that distinction mattered to him a lot. In his head, he gave his victims a choice: survive the trap, appreciate your life, and come out the other side a changed person or die. He genuinely believed that the people he abducted had wasted or abused their lives in some way, and that his traps were a form of rehab. Twisted? Absolutely. But the point is that Jigsaw had a code of sorts, just like Dexter Morgan. John's traps were genuinely terrifying. We're talking reverse bear traps designed to tear faces apart, rooms that slowly filled with razor wire, contraptions that forced victims to crawl through glass or cut through their own bodies to reach a key. It's like an escape room, but on steroids. John didn't do it all by himself. I mean, he's an old man with brain cancer. What do you expect? Apprentices like Amanda Young and Mark Hoffman carried out his will long after Kramer's health deteriorated to the point where he couldn't do it himself. That network, the planning, the resources, all of it made the Jigsaw case a nightmare for law enforcement. Funnily enough, Mark Hoffman, one of the investigators working the case, was secretly one of Jigsaw's own operatives. Classic true crime story, right? But here's what's worth noting about Jigsaw's actual combat capability. The man was dying of brain cancer for the majority of his active years. He was gaunt, physically deteriorating, and almost always operating from a position of complete control, meaning he only ever engaged with victims who were already sedated, already restrained, already locked in a box. He never once faced someone who was prepared for him. He never once went up against another predator. Every single person who ended up in one of his traps got there because they were drugged and had no idea what was coming. John was brilliant, patient, and meticulous, and he is still absolutely, categorically out of his league when it comes to facing off against Dexter Morgan. Now let's talk about Dexter, not the friendly blood spatter analyst or the nerdy coworker who brings donuts to Miami Metro, the real Dexter and what makes him such a threat to someone like Jigsaw. Dexter didn't just stumble into being a murderer the way some killers do. He was literally built for it. At 3 years old, he sat in a pool of his mother's blood, trapped for days in that shipping container, watching her dismembered body decompose around him. That kind of thing rewires you completely. And Dexter was no exception. That early trauma left Dexter with something he called his dark passenger to label his never-ending compulsion to kill. Most people with that level of psychological damage end up on the news or locked away in some mental institution, but his foster father Harry made sure that didn't happen to Dexter. Harry knew almost immediately that Dexter wasn't going to be normal. He saw the signs early, but instead of routing Dexter into the system and hoping for the best, Harry made a decision that would define everything. He taught Dexter to be Dexter. Under Harry's guidance, Dexter became something that was completely unique. He wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. He was basically a vigilante, a killer with a code. By day, Dexter was helping solve murders with the police department, and by night, he was trying to stop them in his own way. Taking out killers on his own, selectively, strategically, and without a trace to feed his dark passenger without hurting anyone who was undeserving. His physical training is pretty wild too. Never forget that Dexter knows jujitsu, he knows pressure point work, and he's an expert at close quarters combat. He carried his almighty M99 etorphine tranquilizer since his earliest days of killing, and if he wanted to kill someone on the spot, all he needs to do is to inject an overdose into their neck. He has perfected measuring the right dosage to do just that, and has no problem getting close enough to his target to administer it. By the most conservative count, Dexter's confirmed kill list goes into the hundreds, and nearly every single one of his victims was another killer. So the question is, could the Jigsaw Killer go toe-to-toe with Dexter Morgan? The short answer? No, not for long anyway. Here's the thing about Jigsaw that most people overlook when they start debating this matchup. Jigsaw's entire system is dependent on the element of surprise. Every single trap in every game, every act of supposed forced rehab he pulled off started the exact same way. The victim had no idea it was coming. They were drugged or sedated or taken off the street. Some were even taken out of their home without a struggle. By the time they woke up, they were locked in the dark, wearing something around their neck, and hearing that deeply disturbing voice come from the tape recorder. Strip that away, and what does Jigsaw actually have? He is a terminally ill man with engineering skills and an unearned god complex. Dexter, on the other hand, is the kind of person that Jigsaw's entire system breaks down against. Understand, Jigsaw doesn't just pick random victims. He researches everyone he wants to pull into his little game before he takes them. He studies them and builds their traps attuned to their specific psychological weaknesses. That process takes time, and it leaves traces. For someone like Dexter, that's a trail, and the first thing he needs before getting a target taken care of. Dexter is a forensic analyst who has spent his entire career following trails that trained detectives couldn't even find. If Jigsaw left even the slightest bit of evidence, Dexter would find it. Now let's just compare these two on the most basic level. Jigsaw's kills require elaborate setup, a network of accomplices, a lot of prep time, and a victim who never sees it coming. On the other hand, Dexter's kills require patience, a confirmed target, and one perfect opportunity that Dexter usually orchestrates himself. When compared, Jigsaw's approach looks flimsy and fragile. Dexter's is almost always a sure thing 100% of the time. The next thing to understand is that Dexter wouldn't even need to be targeted by Jigsaw to end up on his trail because Jigsaw would come right to Dexter. Think about the kind of cases that crossed Dexter's desk at Miami Metro. Pattern killings, bodies with unusual methodology, victims with specific connections to one another. The Jigsaw murders would have triggered every one of his professional instincts the moment they hit the national wire. Multiple victims and a killer who believed he was doing something justified. That last part in particular would have been a red flag that hit Dexter personally. Dexter has no patience for killers who dress up their deadly compulsions in self-righteous moral language. He hardly accepts it for himself after years of seeing the results of his urges. But he's encountered this type of nonsense before. People who convince themselves their murders serve a greater purpose, that they're cleansing or correcting something. In his eyes, that kind of justification is the most dangerous kind of delusion because it means the killer never stops. They'll always find another way to target another victim. There will always be another lesson that needs to be taught when it comes to killers like that. So once Dexter locked onto Jigsaw's pattern, the vetting process would really begin. And in Jigsaw's case, even with all of its elaborate misdirection, he would not survive that process for long. Here's why. Jigsaw was pretty careful about covering his tracks in terms of physical evidence at the trap sites. He knew forensics, he wore gloves, he scrubbed scenes. But his surveillance work, his research on victims, that left a footprint. Dexter would recognize that someone was watching each of the victims for weeks or months before the abductions. Someone was accessing their backgrounds, learning their routines, identifying their pressure points. In the age of digital forensics and database cross-referencing, all of which Dexter had access to through Miami Metro and his other connections in law enforcement, those threads don't stay invisible forever. Dexter has tracked killers who were far more digitally careful than Jigsaw. Some of them even had direct access to law enforcement case files. The Trinity Killer maintained multiple identities across several states for 30 years without being detected. The Ice Truck Killer knew Dexter's methods intimately, even breaking into his apartment whenever he wanted, and still couldn't stay ahead of him. If anything, Jigsaw's reliance on a support network of apprentices, safe houses, and workshop locations for building the elaborate traps he needed would only multiply the number of loose threads Dexter could pull. And once he found one, that's when it would get interesting. Let's say Dexter has done his homework. He confirmed the pattern and identified Kramer. At this point, the version of this story where Jigsaw gets the upper hand is narrow, but it exists, and it's worth acknowledging. Jigsaw, for all his physical limitations, is not stupid. If he became aware that someone was closing in on him, his instinct wouldn't be to run. It would be to turn the investigation into the next game. That's what he does. And a hunter coming for him would be exactly the kind of person he'd want to put in a box. I mean, just think about it for a second. Dexter is methodical. He surveys his targets, he gets close before he strikes. For most of his targets, that surveillance window is the most vulnerable moment, because the target doesn't know they're being watched. But Jigsaw is one of the rare cases where Dexter's target has the experience and the infrastructure to set a counter trap. He's done it before. He turned a detective obsessed with catching him into a participant in one of his games. Come on, he manipulated the very people investigating him. So in one version of this story, Dexter gets close, and Jigsaw's network spots him first. The sedative goes into a drink. Dexter wakes up in the dark and there's a tape recorder. There's something locked around a part of him and the clock starts. That's the moment where most people in the Jigsaw films are already as good as dead. But Dexter Morgan is not like most people, and there's a huge chance that he'll still escape Jigsaw's game. Now let's say the tables turn. Every one of Jigsaw's traps was calibrated to a specific psychological breaking point. He chose victims because he knew where they were fragile. He designed the tests around those fractures. The person who was too selfish would be forced into a situation that required the most extreme act of selflessness. The person who couldn't face their addiction would have to claw through something to reach the antidote. The game worked because it exploited the gap between who the person was and who they'd have to become to survive. Dexter doesn't have that kind of gap. His entire adult life has been one long exercise in operating under extreme psychological and physical pressure without losing his composure. He has been cornered by a special forces sergeant who had assembled undeniable proof of who he was. He has watched his wife die. He has had colleagues, friends, and lovers turn against him. He has been shot, stabbed, chased, framed, and hunted, and he's even broken his own hand to get out of a trap. And in every single one of those situations, the threats didn't fracture him. It focused him. So picture the moment Dexter wakes up in Jigsaw's trap. He doesn't scream, he doesn't spiral, he does what he always does, starting by taking in the environment. He assesses and catalogs information about the space around him, the materials the restraints are made of, the mechanism of whatever device is locked onto him, the acoustics of the room, the light sources, the temperature. He is still a highly skilled forensic analyst who has spent his career reconstructing crime scenes after the fact. He would now be reconstructing and deconstructing one in real time. And here's something that Jigsaw never anticipated in any of his games: a victim who knows as much about human anatomy as he does. Dexter's medical training isn't just background flavor, it's operational. He understands which joints have the most flexibility, which pressure points can be used to create temporary loss of sensation, which muscle groups respond to which stimuli. He's used that knowledge for years to subdue his own targets. In a Jigsaw trap, that same knowledge becomes a tool for escape. It wouldn't be clean or comfortable. Again, Dexter has broken his own bones before rather than let himself die at the hands of someone else. That's survival at any cost, as long as it doesn't compromise the mission. A Jigsaw trap isn't a philosophical barrier like he planned it to be. For Dexter, it's just a mechanical problem, and he can handle those no problem. Once he gets out, and he will get out, the game has changed entirely, and not in a way Jigsaw is prepared for. Because here's what no one who ends up in one of those traps has ever done before: survived, tracked Kramer back, and came for him on their own terms. Dexter has something else working for him that most people don't think about in this context. His rage is cold. That's the critical distinction. Most people who survived Jigsaw's traps were consumed by what happened to them: trauma, fixation, obsession. Some of them became his apprentices, some of them fell apart entirely. What they didn't do was channel that experience into a calm, systematic hunt. But Dexter would. The trap site would become a crime scene to Dexter. Every detail of it would be a data point. The materials used to construct it, the method of sedation, the engineering of the mechanism, all of it traceable for someone with the right background. And Dexter has exactly the right background. He's the person that Miami Metro calls when a scene doesn't make sense. He understands manufacturing signatures, fiber transfers, the chemical composition of adhesives and solvents. The same forensic toolkit he'd used to vet his targets for years would now be turned on the man who put him in that room. Jigsaw could move locations, he could cycle through safe houses, rotate his workshop, change his patterns. But every move he made would consume resources and time. Time that a man with terminal brain cancer doesn't have to waste. And resources require people. And people make mistakes. Amanda Young made mistakes. Mark Hoffman made enormous mistakes. The more pieces in a machine, the more ways it can fail. The more he tried to conceal himself and rally his resources, the bigger his trail would become. And unfortunately for him, Dexter only ever needs one loose thread to get what he wants. There's one more layer to this that rarely gets brought up, and it's arguably the most damning for Jigsaw. Jigsaw's entire operation hinges on secrecy. Everything he does depends on nobody with the right skill set knowing where to look. And to be fair, for most of his run, that worked. Law enforcement was reactive. They found the aftermath. They found the survivors stumbling out of trap rooms covered in blood. They found the bodies. But they were always at least one move behind. Dexter doesn't investigate reactively. That's the difference. He moves parallel to the case, sometimes even well ahead of it. He has operated inside a homicide department for years, which means he understands not just how crimes are investigated, but how investigations are stalled. He knows exactly where the bureaucratic gaps are. He knows all about jurisdictional handoffs and other common blind spots. He uses those gaps, and he has been using them his entire career. This isn't new to him at all. So while law enforcement was still trying to figure out how the latest trap worked, Dexter would already be 3 steps ahead. His entire life has trained him to operate in that space between what the system knows about a killer's last act and what they are planning to do next. And that's the space where Jigsaw operates and usually thrives. thrives. But sadly for him, that's a space that Dexter Morgan truly owns. Let's be clear about how this ends. Dexter won't need much, just one clear window of opportunity. One moment when Jigsaw's network isn't watching, when the layer of protection around him has been peeled back enough to allow someone to slip past it. Dexter has manufactured that moment dozens of times against targets who were far harder to reach. The Trinity Killer had a family, a community, a church, and 30 years of experience covering his tracks. The Skinner had informants. Aaron Spence had control of the homicide department. Lots of the killers Dexter has taken out had things at their disposal that they thought made them safer, but in reality, those all just ended up being areas that someone like Dexter could exploit to get rid of them. As brilliant as he was, John Kramer had one fundamental vulnerability that Dexter had already accounted for a long time ago. He worked from a fixed ideological position and relied on lackeys. Jigsaw believed he was the most unpredictable force in any room, and that kind of false assumption would be the thing to bring his entire operation down. Once he was finally ahead of Jigsaw and saw what he was planning next, Jigsaw's position of safety would be completely compromised. He could lay in wait for John as he was moving from one location to the next. Dexter could use Jigsaw's henchmen to get information to help him find John's hiding place, or even to lure him somewhere, just like he used Hector Estrada to lure Maria to the shipyard before her death. But what's important is that one of those things or something very similar would definitely happen. Jigsaw just isn't smart enough, physically strong enough, or prepared enough to stop Dexter from getting ahead of him at some point. If Jigsaw is arrogant enough to pull Dexter into one of his games, thinking he is just another regular person he can outmaneuver, he wouldn't be having fun for very long. And once the needle goes in, Jigsaw goes limp, and then John Kramer would be the one slowly opening his eyes, confused and trapped in a dark room, completely at someone else's mercy. It would finally be game over. So what do you think? Is there any version of this where Jigsaw actually comes out on top? Drop your take in the comments, and if you liked this breakdown, go check out our video on Dexter versus the Zodiac Killer. As always, slash that subscribe button and consider leaving a like before you go. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.